Hello and welcome to Articulate Economics, exploring Australia's balance of payments and trade dynamics in a global context. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're very excited to present this topic. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise the continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you're on and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect and to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. This is an outline of what we will cover in the webinar tonight, and I will quickly run through some housekeeping and then we'll hear from Dr. Mokhtarul Wadud for all things economics and balance of payments. Tonight's webinar is delivered in partnership with the School of Economics here at the university, and it couldn't have been possible without Dr. Wadud and his willingness to share his expertise and insights in this topic. We're very excited to present this specific item that was requested directly from teachers, and we very much appreciate all your contribution and ideas in designing this talk. Mokhtarul, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joyce. It is an honor to be able to speak on this topic, and it is great to see interest on this topic from the wider audience, from the schools and from other communities. Okay, so I'll talk about Australia's balance of payments and trade dynamics in a global context. And this topic really means that I will first talk about trade as a basis, because trade is where we start everything from. So trade is very important. And as we talk about current account balance, we know that current account is very important. And a current account is a major component of balance of payments of any country. So firstly, I'll give you a brief outline of my talk. I'll talk about comparative advantage as a basis for trade, because this is something we often do not realize, that trade takes place on the basis of comparative advantage, and how comparative advantage has changed over time, and Australia's place in that dynamics of comparative advantage over time. And I'll talk about balance of payments as an introduction of the concept and the major components of balance of payments, and then the trends in Australia's various components of balance of payments, like capital account and current account and financial account. Then before I finish, I'll talk about some external shocks that we do not have control over and how that can have implications for our economy and for the balance of payment and also current account deficit or surpluses. And lastly, I will talk about some policy implications and challenges. So to understand comparative advantage, which is the basis for trade, and that's where we begin our international transaction, we need to understand that comparative advantage is the basis for trade, and countries trade on the basis of comparative advantage, not on the basis of absolute advantages. And this theory was first devised by a famous economist whose name was David Ricardo in the 19th century. So what this theory really means that countries can have opportunity cost or a lower opportunity cost in the production of a particular good or service. And comparative advantage is based on the lower opportunity cost. So a country may have differences in labor productivity. A country may have higher labor productivity compared to other countries. There may be some relative supplies of capital or other resources. And these will also determine a country's differences in opportunity cost. So in other words, if a country has got a lower opportunity cost in the production of a certain good or service, that country will export that particular good or service. So that is the fundamental behind how trade takes place based on comparative advantage. So what is the benefit of comparative advantage, or what's the benefit of trade altogether? The benefit of trade is the gains from trade. So we gain, and by gain we mean welfare or overall satisfaction in terms of income, in terms of export earning, in terms of overall consumer surplus and other benefits. So countries use their finite resources to produce what most productive at, what they're most productive at, and then they trade those products for what they want to consume. So countries can specialize in production while consuming many goods and services through trade. So specialization is through production, and then they consume by exporting and importing. And that is the basis for trade, and that's how countries can gain overall. Now, one thing that we have seen in the last 20 years or so is the trade restrictions. We know that trade restrictions like tariffs or quota restrictions or product-specific restrictions can restrict imports and exports. So these are the restrictions which can distort a country's comparative advantage. So what the world has done for this, under the WTO, which is World Trade Organization, and GATT, after the Second World War, there has been a major move in the world towards freer trade of goods and services. So why we need freer trade? Because if we allow freer trade or less protection, that would let the countries be able to exploit their comparative advantage more effectively and benefit from those exploitation of comparative advantages. So if we look at the WTO, which is World Trade Organization, which was formed in 1995. So since the formation of WTO, the pace of globalization has accelerated, which really meant that for many countries, the competition in the international trade has increased. So countries now have to face more competition in the international trade, and therefore they have to be more efficient. And therefore, this also has lots of implications for Australia's economy, because we need to be competitive, because we have lost lots of competitors around us in terms of production of various goods and services. So that's the background behind why and how we can think of trade and how trade can take place on the basis of comparative advantage. And then we talk about the theory behind this particular approach, where we can think about how to measure comparative advantage. And because this is the basis of trade, right? And that will create surplus from trade or deficit from trade. One of the major methods that we use for measuring comparative advantage is called as Revealed Comparative Advantage Index, or RCA for short. Now, this is the index which was devised for the first time by a famous economist whose name was Balassa in 1965. And his point was that a country who has got a comparative advantage in the production of a certain good or service should be able to reveal that advantage through its export promotion or export volume. We call that export share. So there is a particular formula for calculation of RCA indices, which I'm not showing here, but I'll just tell you some or show you some data and some statistics. The other approach, which is also used in literature, is called as Grubel-Lloyd Index of intra-industry trade. Now, intra-industry as opposed to inter-industry also measures comparative advantage, and I will exactly show you how that happens with some data. Now, in the next slide, you can see a ladder on the right-hand side. We have 5 different boxes. If we consider that right-hand side as a ladder, we can consider that as a ladder of comparative advantage with 5 rungs. So in the ladder of comparative advantage on the right-hand side with 5 different rungs, we can see that in the bottom boxes, a country can specialize in the production and export of goods and services, or like primary goods and services or primary resources. And then the country can move on to unskilled labor-intensive manufactured goods like textiles and clothing. And the country can move on to skilled labor-intensive manufactured goods like electronics, and then can move on to exporting machinery and automobiles, which will be more like capital-intensive products, and then can move on to knowledge-intensive services exports. So do this ladder of comparative advantage really work for every country? The answer is not necessarily. For many countries of Southeast Asia, and even for maybe South Korea and Japan, that has happened. If you look at their history of last 60 or 70 years, they have moved along this ladder of comparative advantage from initial resource or agricultural products exporting economies, or maybe garments or clothing exporting economies to more knowledge-intensive economies. So that ladder of competitive advantage can explain to a certain extent how some countries have moved along this ladder and they have reaped the benefits from competitive advantage as they moved along from specialization of a unskilled labor-intensive product to a more skilled labor-intensive to a capital-intensive products categories. So for Australia, what is happening? For Australia, we can see that Australia already have this competitive advantage in natural resources and mineral products. So in commodities, we have competitive advantage. We also have some advantages in terms of capital-intensive goods, and especially in medical equipment. However, we haven't moved along the ladder like a developing country. So Australia has long had a competitive advantage in primary goods, particularly in natural resources and agriculture, as you know. And iron ore, coal, gold are good examples of it. And then we never have had that sort of long-lasting, I should say, skilled and unskilled labor-intensive, competitive advantage in those categories, like in skilled and unskilled labor-intensive products. So these two boxes are not highlighted in that sense. However, Australia has made some progress in capital-intensive manufacturing, mainly in the production of processed metals and machineries, because we have got some resources like iron ore and stuff like those, for which we can, based on which we can really take advantage of processed metals and machineries. Also, Australia has got some achievements, has achieved something in terms of exporting some medical equipments. Like we know that CSL Limited is a major Australian biotech company, which is globally known and which is a multinational company at the moment. So there are certain places where Australia has proven its presence in the international market through its competitive advantage, but not the way that the ladder of competitive advantage can show or can predict. The next slide is some estimates from one of my research in the past, where we can show that from 1981 to 2005, now this is about before and after the formation of WTO. WTO was formed in 1995. And after the formation of WTO, the trade in textiles and garments had to go through a phase-out process where all the quota restrictions should phase out by 2005. And this was effected by this agreement called Agreement on Textiles and Clothing, ATC. So, and this process was known as phase-out process. So as the production was phasing out or quantitative restriction was phasing out from the world trade, countries were facing more competition. So what is happening to these, to the competitive advantage of these countries as the competition was rising over this period? So if you look at these RC indices, now a negative number here is a disadvantage and a positive number is an advantage because these are log values, okay? So for Australia from 1981 to 2005, you can see that there are negative figures and the intensity is rising, which is really showing that Australia's competitive advantage in the export of textiles trade was diminishing that time, okay? And of course, compared to that, we can see in many developing economies, the numbers are positive because they had competitive advantage, and those indices are rising over time. Like Australia, for other developed economies also, you can see the indices are negative. So that shows how the competitive advantage has become negative for them. So there is no advantage in trading textiles or exporting textiles. And the same thing happened for garments or clothing. So if you look at Australia's indices here, again, these are negative figures which show a comparative disadvantage in the export of clothing for Australia and similar for other developed economies. Whereas for developing economies, these figures were positive because they were gaining over time. Then we look at this Global Lloyd Index of intra-industry trade in textiles over about the same time. So do we have a support to this view that for the developed world, the competitive advantage in the unskilled labor intensive products, like in textiles and clothing, was falling over this period. So is it, further, substantiated with these indices? The answer is yes, because these global Lloyd indexes show that if the indices are going up in terms of value, the trade is becoming more intra-industry. Intra-industry means when trade is happening within the industry itself. For example, if a country is exporting fabric and importing, finished material, or exporting, basic wool or cotton and importing fabric, then that's intra-industry, within the industry. So these indices rising means the trade is becoming more intra-industry, and there will be more specialization, and there is less diversification. Less diversification means that you are not specializing in the whole trade, like in the whole sector of clothing or textiles. You are just doing a part of it. So for the developed countries, we can see that these are rising. So trade was becoming more intra-industry, not inter-industry. And for the developing world, these are falling. So the support here is, again, for clothing industry, the bottom part, table 4, is showing for the clothing industry. The indices are rising. So we can see clearly that over this period, competitive advantage in semi-skilled or unskilled labor-intensive products like textiles and garments really fell for Australia and also for other developed nations, whereas the developing countries were rising. Of course, you would know that, you would think that this is normal because this is semi-skilled labor-intensive industry, so where the cost of labor is low, right? Of course, the countries can take advantage of their cheaper labor cost, and that is absolutely right. That is very true. Provided there is no trade restrictions. So under WTO phase-out program, trade restrictions were phasing out, so competitions were rising. So if you can produce at a cheaper labor cost, you can export more. Now let's look at, for Australia, what is happening if we look at RC indices. Now these indices are the actual indices of export share. So any index more than 1 means there is competitive advantage. Any index less than 1 means there is no competitive advantage. So for manufacturing and machinery and transport equipment as a whole, and as the share of the whole world, we can see that our competitive advantage has declined over time from the period of 2005 to 2016-17, around that time. Okay, in the more recent times, we can see some prospects, but overall, we don't have competitive advantage in these product categories. Whereas for minerals and iron ores and metal, we do have competitive advantage. You can see the indices are very high. If it is more than 1, we have a competitive advantage. If it is 16 or 17 or 20 or 10, we certainly have lots of power in the international market in terms of export share. And then if you look at it specifically, what are the particular products where we have competitive advantage at the moment, right? So we can see that we have sustained our advantages in these primary resource products, in these minerals and some of these basic commodities, like in coal, in iron ore and concentrates, in aluminum ore and concentrate, in hide and skin, in barley, right? So these are rather sustained because these are RC indices and these are more than 1. Some of the indices are very high, like iron ore and concentrate, close to 30 and 40. And even the indices for wool and coal. So we have sustained competitive advantage in some of these basic commodities and resource-based products, which is a good thing for us. Now we talk about balance of payment. So in balance of payment, once we have this export and import trade, then we have other transactions taking place. So in this particular slide, we are showing that, excuse me. So we have this world on the left-hand side, and the shaded areas are the members of the WTO countries. On the right-hand side, we have taken out the Australia's map and tried to show that how Australia is exporting its goods and services and importing goods and services. And of course, this export and import is also creating or inducing other transactions of financial assets. So we often say that for open economy, like for any economy which which has got export and import trade and which has got international transaction, right? Most of the economies, they are like that. So this is an obvious part. Like we'll have a payment going on for export. We'll receive some payment for exports. We'll pay money for imports. And then we also pay money and receive money for financial transactions. So that creates the background of what we call as the component of balance of payment. So firstly, we talk about current account, because current account is about export and import trade. And we just discussed about what trade is and how trade takes place on the basis of comparative advantage. And now we look at the basic default split of the balance of payment account. The default split is 3. So in the balance of payment account, we have 3 different accounts: current account, capital account, and financial account. However, for Australia, there is a slight change here. I mean, we have balance of payment divided into 2 distinct categories. And one is the current account, the other one is capital and financial account. So what do these mean then? Now, current account includes trade in goods and services and income between Australian residents and other countries. So trade in goods and services include exports and imports of goods and services. Then we have primary income and secondary income, also included in current account. So the primary income is an important part that we need to understand. Primary income are what we call as the payments for factors. We know that in a typical production process, there are 4 factors of production. We call that land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And these 4 factors of production have got 4 different payments. For land, we have rent. For labor, we have wages. For capital, we have interest. For entrepreneurship, we have dividends or profit. So these factor payments that Australia receives from overseas for their factors of production that they employ there, and the Australians which pay to the overseas residents, those form the primary income. So in terms of primary income, we just consider the dividends and interest and wages that Australia receives to make it simplified. The secondary income balance includes the remittances and foreign aid and gifts. So these are more like what you call as transfer payments. Okay. So again, current account has got these 3 things: trade balance, which is current account balance, like balance of export and import, and then we have primary income and secondary income balance. Now, you will see that of these 3 components of current account, the export-import figure is very much emphasized. We often talk about trade balances. And when we talk about trade balances, we are talking about the first component, which is export minus import. You may have seen another phrase called net exports. Net exports is export minus import. And that is an important part because net export or current account balance is very much, a component of the aggregate demand function. And of course, within the aggregate demand function, this current account balance has primarily trade balance, which is export minus import. So it is not surprising that we often talk about current account balance as a priority or with some sort of emphasis in our everyday talk about policies in formal lectures or in formal documentations also. So if you look at the current account, and if we look at this graph here, we can see, because we have a better view here with this graph. So we have current account has got 3 different components of current account. Trade balance, which is exports, which we can call as net exports, export minus import. We have primary income, which are like factor payments. So if you just remember that factor payments, like wages, interest, dividends are profits for entrepreneurship or for shareholder, right? So factor payments Australian residents receive minus factor payments they make to the rest of the world. The secondary income has got the transfer payments plus any tax dividends or tax rebates or refunds that we receive or we pay overseas. So these 3 distinct components make up current account. Again, of these 3, trade balance, the top is very important. And of course, I have spoken about the importance of comparative advantage, which primarily addresses who would gain from trade and who would be exporting more or less. So then we move on to the second component of balance of payment, which is capital and financial account. Now, capital and financial account includes capital and financial transactions involving Australia and rest of the world. Now, capital account includes capital transfer and transfer of non-financial assets. So it is important to understand what do this mean. Of course, I will show it in more detail in the next slide. And financial account includes transactions between parties that involve a change of ownership of Australia's assets or liabilities. Now, you will see that this capital and financial account is a major component now, and of these two, financial account is a bigger component altogether. So then we have this concept of accounting or double entry. Now, double entry really means it's like an accounting exercise that for balance of payment, every economic transaction has got two corresponding entries. We say one credit and a debit. And an example is when Australia exports goods like wheat, a credit entry is made to record the value provided to the overseas buyer. Simultaneously, a debit entry is equal value is recorded when Australian seller receives the payment. So we have a credit entry and a debit entry. And this double entry system ensures that the balance of payments remains zero. And there is a famous phrase used in economics and also macroeconomics, and that says balance of payment always balances. Now, balance of payment always balances means theoretically balance of payment would be equal to zero. So the sum of these accounts like current account plus capital account and financial account should be equal to zero. However, in real terms, when we actually measure them, the sum may not be equal to zero because of some human errors or some other discrepancy in the process of building these accounts. And we take care of those by adding an additional concept called, or additional term called, statistical discrepancy. And this is also known as net errors and omissions, because we are human. So to err is human. Humans can commit mistakes. And so that all happens all the time. So if you look at any statistical publication on balance of payment accounts from any country, if we scrutinize that carefully, you will see that at the bottom of that account, there is a term called net errors and omissions, because that is to ensure that there has been some statistical discrepancy which has to be taken care of. So that is perfectly normal. So if you look at this capital and financial accounts here, on the left-hand side, we have capital account. On the right-hand side, we have financial account, a bit more, summative format so that we can see better. So capital account has got two things: capital transfer and acquisition of disposable and non-produced or non-financial assets. So capital transfer means when Australian residents or non-residents transfer their ownership of fixed assets. So somebody buys a house overseas or sells a house, those things. Debt forgiveness and conditional grant on capital projects. So if someone invests money or gives money or gives a grant to invest in a capital project, those things will come under capital transfer of the capital account. And the second point is acquisition or disposal of non-produced or non-financial assets include transactions involving intangible assets like patents, trademarks, and right to use natural resources, those things. So which are more intangible. You cannot see those you cannot touch those, but patents are intangible. We know what patent is, or trademarks and right to use, like having a license to fish in the waters of a particular state in Australia. The second component of the capital and financial account is up to the financial account, which is more comprehensive in nature. It has got multiple parts. The first one is the direct investment. The direct investment component of financial account really refers to the foreign direct investments, right? So if you see a liability, that's a foreign capital inflow, an asset is a foreign capital outflow. Then we have portfolio investment. Portfolio investment is made in the stocks and bonds, and other investments may also include financial transactions, including loans and currency deposits. Then we have financial derivative, the purchase or sale of financial derivatives such as financial contracts between two parties. And in this financial derivative, the value is transferred, the risk is transferred, not necessarily the actual ownership. Then we have reserve assets like purchase and sales of foreign reserves and including gold, right? And then we have other investment, which includes transactions such as trade credit, where goods are purchased and paid for later, and currency and deposits involving cross-border bank transactions and so on. So one can always look at those details and see what are the items included. In the next slide, I'm showing the balance of payment main accounts in the last 2 quarters, in the September quarter of last year and in the December quarter of last year. And what we have on the left-hand side is balance of current account. We know what is the balance of current account. And then we have capital and financial account. And balance of current account has got 2 components here, balance on goods and services and the net primary income. We haven't included the secondary income here, but these 2, the second row and third row, are the parts of balance of current account. Then we have capital and financial account and international investment position. So as we say that current account balance seasonally adjusted rose by this amount to a surplus of 11,800 million. So you can see here under the column December 23, we have a positive figure, means we have a current account balance surplus. So it's a good thing that in the more recent times, Australia has got a current account balance surplus, which did not happen if you go back, 10 years before. I mean, even 3-4 years earlier. Okay. I'll explain why that happened, which is a good thing. Then we have balance on goods and services, and then we have net primary income. So some of these 2 would make these balances here, okay? Because these 2 components is part of the current account balance. Then we have capital and financial account, which is here, right? And we have got 3484 and we have minus 9730. So of course, if we have the current account surplus and deficit, that will offset the capital and financial account would offset that. All right, so then we talk about this, we show these diagrams here, right? So on the left-hand side, we have Australia's current account balance over time. So if you look back to 1960, about that time, and these data from ABS and RBA. So what really happened? The green line is the current account balance. So they moved around 0, and they were negative most of the time. So this is 0. This is percent of nominal GDP, of course. So this is a rate. In the more recent times, of course, current account has become surplus here as a percent of nominal GDP. So what has driven this? If you look at the composition of exports here, you can see that our resource export has increased significantly. Now, this is share of total exports. So of the total export, we are now exporting almost 60%, about 60% resources. And now compared to services, compared to manufacturing and other goods exports. So resources are driving our current account surplus for sure. If you look at the composition of imports on the bottom right-hand corner, of course, you can see, again, share of total. The services share has fallen recently. The other imports, consumer goods, have remained same, about between 10 to 20% level. So there is like a sustained sort of import activity going on. Now, if you look at the top right-hand corner here, we have Australia's trade in goods and services. And you can see here the imports and exports, how they compare with each other. So you can see that for most of this time, from 1960, 1970, until 2009, 2010, we had a negative balance there in the trade. Whereas in the more recent time, we have a surplus here. Export is crossing imports. The blue line is export and the yellow line is import. So we can see a trade surplus here, which is also shown in the with these green bars, right? So any bar going above 0 is a surplus. All right, so then we look at the export volumes. Of course, we have these are log scales, so resources here, and we have services and rural, and we have manufacturing. So we can see that resources, they are rising, the volume is rising. So in absolute sense, the volume is rising. And if you look at the right-hand side, the services export was rising, but it fell drastically because we had COVID-19. So around 2020, these exports fell. If you look at the right side, resource exports are split in iron ore, coal, and LNG. and you can see the split. So of course, LNG is rising in terms of volume, and iron ore also rising in terms of volume. And also, you know that the commodity prices have increased recently, which is also helping with these current account balance surpluses. So the recent surplus in the trade balance is primarily driven by high commodity prices and increased volume, which is also causing increased volume. And those are in iron ore, liquid natural gas, and coal exports. Now, trends in Australia's balance of payments, capital and financial accounts, if we just again look at the last 2 quarters, September 23 and December 23, we have capital account, and these are the various compositions of capital account. And we have financial account. These are the 5 different categories of financial account. And these are various items like acquisition of and disposal of non-produced, non-financial assets, which are credits and which are debits. And we have capital transfer, credit and debit. All these are tabulated. And as we go at the bottom, we have this net errors and omissions, because with credit and debit entry, if they are not equal to each other, we'll have some discrepancy. And that's the net errors and omissions. Okay, so which has to be taken care of separately. If we look at the dynamics of current account and capital account and financial account over the last 30-40 years or so, beginning from 1970, we can see that this is the growth path of capital and financial account. And we can see that for a major part of the time, beginning from 1970, around that time, until 2014 and 15, we had a surplus in the capital and financial account before we ran into deficit. Now, this is the time where we had the mining boom ending. So mining boom played an important role in shaping the current and capital account balance, especially in the capital and financial account. Mining boom played an important role. As the mining boom in Australia finished in 2013 and 2014, our capital and financial account started to show negative or a deficit in its balance. So one way to look at that is to look at the foreign direct investment. So if you look at this left-hand side diagram here, we can see that net foreign liabilities is the net FDI, or net foreign direct investment. So what happened to this net foreign liabilities over time? So beginning from 2000 up to 2023, we can see that the total net foreign liability was going okay, about 60% of the nominal GDP, or slightly less than 60%. But from about this time, it started to fall. And this is again the time of end of the mining boom, right? So that marked a major change in terms of the influx or inflow of foreign investment into Australia. On the right-hand side, this is summarized like net capital flows is going down. And you can see that from about 2014 and 2016, this was going down drastically, okay? And then the composition of these capital flows like portfolio investment, FDI, financial derivatives, those are shown with these bars with different colors. So we now know that there has been a net capital outflow, and there has been a fall in foreign direct investment, especially after the mining boom was over in 2014, 2015. And that is one of the things that we realized. If you look at the international investment position, which is which represents the balance of foreign assets owned by Australian residents and the liabilities they owe to foreign residents. So it's like balance between the assets we have and the liabilities that we have, okay? So we can see that how these are changing, especially we can look at the last column here, position at the end of period. So you can see that in terms of net international investment position, we had some positive figures here. In terms of net foreign equity, we have negative figures. And net foreign debt, we have some positive figures, right? So that shows our international investment position. And if we look at the last few points are about external shocks. So what is really happening? I mean, we know that we have been exporting our natural resource based items or commodities. We are exporting our minerals and our processed metals quite substantially, and in the more recent times, the commodity prices have increased. So we are doing well in terms of current account balance. So let's look at the global economic factors. We know that commodity price fluctuations have been a major thing happening of late. So changes in global prices for key Australian exports like iron ore, coal, and natural resources, or natural gas, have impacted the trade balance. And then there have been some, wars and economic trade wars and some disputes about tariff imposition of putting tariffs. So the effects of international trade tensions and policy changes, they are also very important. And particularly, we know that we have had issues with China of late, and even with US, right? So those have been some of the factors which have affected our foreign trade. Then, of course, very importantly, our exchange rate movement in the more recent times have been a major concern. So with high exchange rate, we know that import prices go up and the exports become more competitive, but import costs increase also. So that is also affecting our inflation rate domestically. And we have geopolitical uncertainty and policy uncertainty. We know that slow real income growth has been an issue, has been a concern for the last 5-6 years. Many economists, many policymakers are talking about the fact that in Australia, we are not having much of our real income growth. Our real income growth has become rather stagnant more recently. And more so in the post-pandemic years, as we are having higher inflation, RBA is trying to, raise interest rates to contain inflation as much as possible with some sort of impact, but still there are things to achieve. So it has not finished yet. So what happened is that we also have this geopolitical tension worldwide, which is also causing the oil prices to go up, which is also causing some other uncertainties, affecting our trade balance and affecting our balance of payments overall. Not to forget about the confidence that the investors need to invest in Australia. So the reason why we're having less foreign direct investment partially is that we have the mining boom, which is over now, but also due to the fact that we have this global tension and we haven't got an attractive set of sectors where the foreign investors can think that they can invest, right? So apart from the housing market, perhaps, but not in the manufacturing industry. So let's look at this graph here. On the left-hand side, we show the index of commodity prices and how commodity prices has increased in the more recent times. So you can clearly see that from 1988, from 1985, the prices have increased, and very, very quickly or drastically from 2016 onwards, the commodity prices have increased. And this is also helping Australia, right? Now, if we look at this split here, right, oil and LNG prices, we can see that in the more recent times, the LNG prices are very volatile and they're very up, they're very high as well, right? Oil prices are very volatile. So as I just mentioned, that due to lots of geopolitical issues and tensions, oil prices have become disrupted, has become more volatile. On the right-hand side, we can see that bulk commodity prices. So if we look at the split of these, commodities, like here, on the left-hand side, we have this overall index. On the right-hand side, if we split those prices separately, we have iron ore prices, we have thermal coal prices, and we have coking coal prices. And these are the spot prices, and we can see that the prices are up in the more recent times, okay? And also they're more volatile. So are there trade disruptions happening with the global supply chain, being, failing or being interrupted with lots of factors? The answer is yes. If we think about the, ordering an automobile, ordering a good car, which is imported from overseas, it takes some time. So there has been some supply chain disruptions in the system, which has affected Australia also. And these are some of the things that we need to be, careful about. So export costs increased due to higher shipping fees and logistical challenges, especially after the pandemics. And during the pandemics, we know that in 2020 and 2021, especially Australia was under lockdown, especially the major cities. So we were affected that time. Travel and tourism was affected as well during that time, and significantly affecting the services trade balance in Australia. Government gave lots of stimulus packages to the households, to the investors, and despite this, of course, we haven't been able to attract many foreign investment, and we are still trying to find out an optimal way to mitigate the problems of the macroeconomy we have, and to promote our balance of payments more aggressively, and to have a sustainable competitive advantage in some of the sectors. So talking about that sustainability, we know that in traditional resource-based sectors, we have sustainable competitive advantage. The issue here is, and the question here is that whether we can retain that as we have changes in technology. So as you have more electric vehicle, more renewable energy being used throughout the whole world, shall we be able to export coal the way we do that today? So those things will change as we see technological change and changes in preferences. And therefore, it is a matter of thinking about having something more sustainable over years to come. So there should be opportunities for export diversification along the competitive advantage ladder, which Australia has not done yet, but there should be opportunity for exploring niche markets and developing high-value industries, which may be able to help leverage existing competitive advantages and foster sustainable economic growth for the future. And we have lost competitive advantage in labor-intensive products and in other manufacturing sector. So perhaps there is a possibility of regaining competitive advantage in some manufacturing sector, which will be more capital intensive. Then there has been lots of issues about macroeconomic stability, because we need to have prudent fiscal and monetary policies in place, because those will have impact on or implication for balance of payment. And we need to have productivity growth to mitigate the sluggish real income growth problem, right? Because that will have also implication on our export growth and balance of payments. And in the post-pandemic recovery phase, as you can see that we need fiscal stimulus packages. There have been some accommodative monetary policy taken by RBA, but that process is yet to be over, and we are yet to regain our pre-pandemic level and trend of growth and economic prosperity. An important thing that we now realize that foreign investment has been slow in Australia more recently, although we have surplus in our current account balance, but that foreign investment growth has to be stimulated. And that needs to be taken care of separately as a policy measure. So overall, if you talk about balance of payment account and sustainability, and that's what we need to achieve. And that can be achieved with a sustainable current account balance, maybe current account surplus, and with some sustainable competitive advantage, and maybe by stimulating foreign investment into Australia, and with some prudent monetary and fiscal policy altogether. So that will be the feature of Australia's, and hopefully that will ensure that we will have a more manageable economy and more sustainable balance of payment accounts in the days to come. So that's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this presentation. I hope students and teachers found it helpful. I'll just go straight into the Q&A. Okay, the first one is double entry accounting question. In the example provided, when the Australian seller receives payment, why is it a debit? Is it not credit transaction as it is an inflow to funds into Australia?
Yeah, okay, so this is the example which I gave here. Okay. When you export an item, a credit entry is provided. So any export is entered as a credit because it's a value created, and therefore any export item. So when you export something like a provision of the value to another party, that's credit. So without thinking that as a one-way transaction, if we think about the product going and value coming to us, so that's why it's two-way. Because we may think about the transactions to be taking place only once, and there's only one thing coming out of it, which is money. But I get money, the other party gets the product, right? So there's a double thing all the time. The thing is, why is debit and credit? So that's the standard. Like the value we create for others, when we export, that's the credit, and when we import, and the a debit entry is equal to the value recorded when the Australian seller receives the payment. So when you receive the payment, that's a debit, and when we export, the value is a credit. So that's the standard, because that credit is the value given to them. So in that sense, and debit is the money we are receiving. In that sense. So without thinking that as a one thing, like I am exporting something and I receive money, but the other party also receives the value or the good, right? So the value there is the credit there, and the money I receive is a debit. So that's the standard procedure, and the vice versa. So this credit means really the value provided, the value created, and debit means the money received in that sense. So it may sound confusing, but that's how the trade is done. So whenever we create a value, we consider that as a debit, as a credit in the export account, and whenever you receive the money, that becomes a debit, like the import value, the money which is received. It's not the other way around. But if they export to you something, that they will just do it accordingly. So any exports from overseas coming to you will be their credit, and the money you pay would be their debit, because you are getting the value. That's how it is regarded as debit and credit. Now, this is a standard procedure. If you don't like it, then we have to change it, but it remains all the same. So plus and minus, right? But in the actual accounting of balance of payment, that's how it is done. We consider credit as the value created or value transferred, and the money received is debit. So that's one. So if you think about value given versus money received, then that will explain it.
Just to follow up very quickly on this one, debits are defined as outflow of funds asset. Why is it in this scenario to the debit viewed as funds coming in?
Okay, yeah. So in this scenario, we're talking about the actual product, not the actual asset. So when you're talking about capital account or asset, then that will be a bit different. So in terms of the actual export of good or services, it's the value which is calculated as the outflow, not the actual fund. So it's not the asset which we are receiving, because asset is the value that we are providing. So that is regarded as the outflow. So it is not the actual money that we're receiving here. We are receiving the payment made for the value that we are sending. So when we're exporting a particular product, it is not like selling an asset there, right? It's not asset. So asset is different. So if we transfer an asset, that's different. But if we export something, it is transferring of value to the other party. And in that sense, so if you confuse this trade of manual goods and services, suppose I'm exporting a shirt or a particular merchandise, if you confuse that with a financial asset, that will be confusing. So therefore, this is like export is transfer of value to overseas, and therefore this is a credit, and whatever money we get in payment for that, that's a debit. I mean, that's how it is done. But yeah, so it's not payment for assets or financial asset transfer. That's why.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Another question that has come in: if an individual sends a conditional foreign aid to another country, which is recorded as a debit in NSY, how is it recorded on the KAFA?
Right. Okay. If an individual sends unconditional foreign aid to another country, this will be, yeah. So if it's a value transfer to another country in the capital and financial account, it will be regarded as a credit in our account, because it's a value transfer.
Thank you for that. The next one that we've got is: in which account will the following transaction occur? A foreign investor purchasing land in Australia, will the initial flow of funds in the scenario above be categorized as a capital transfer?
If a foreign investor is purchasing a land in Australia, that will be in the capital account, and it is in the first of the capital account where the asset is being transferred. So, yeah. So the question is, yeah. So it will be in the capital account. And what is the second part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. The second part of the question was, will be categorized as a capital transfer.
It will be capitalized. Yes, that's right. It will be categorized as a capital outflow.
And the
If a
last
foreign
one,
asset, if a foreign resident, or sorry, foreigner buys an asset in Australia, it will be capital outflow. Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And the last one we've received, is the Australian economy at risk of experiencing Dutch disease?
Yeah, very good question. Dutch disease phenomena occurs when we have currency appreciation due to export of resource boom, which we saw during mining boom a little bit. Of course, it didn't have Dutch disease, but it may happen. So what really happens that with that some export boom, we have currency appreciating, and then other industries can start to die or start to become less competitive because as the currency appreciates, import costs are higher. Export becomes less competitive. Yeah. So whether we are on the verge of having Dutch disease, it is difficult to answer, but there is no concern at the moment. At the moment, there is no concern because our currency is not appreciating that much yet. Our currency is not appreciating. But if it appreciates, if we see that we are having this trade surplus because we have this promotion of exports of resources, and there has been a resource boom, maybe another mining boom coming up, and if our currency is also appreciating, then if it sustains for some time, and if we can see that other industries are being affected with that currency appreciation, then the concern would come. But in the near future, that's not being seen at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That is the end of the Q&A. I'll just quickly jump all the way to the end. To stay up to date with our upcoming events and opportunities, you can also sign up to our Participate Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences newsletter, and this is delivered specifically to a high school audience. So you just scan the QR code and you can fill in the subscription form for that one as well. And this is where we advertise the rest of the Articulate Talk series as well, very similar to how we advertise the economics one there on the right. And these are some of the next Articulate talks that we have coming up. So we have Studies of Religion coming up next Thursday. One of our academics will present on St. Paul and Christian bioethics. And on the 20th of June, we'll have one on English and Billy Elliot in particular. And then on the 27th of June, we're very excited to introduce a newly designed writing skills workshop, which will be applied all across English, HESE subjects, languages, PD Health PE, creative and performing arts, and so on. And you can also register for those by scanning the QR codes on the screen. And I just want to say thank you, a big thank you to Mokhtarul for all his work in putting the slides together and explaining the BOP so well. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We wish you a lovely night and we hope to see you soon.